that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. We are outside the presence of the jury. I had an opportunity to look at the medical notes for Dr. Davis. Is this marked, Mr. King, as D-TR-73?
Not yet, but I would like to mark it.
Okay, all right.
And, Your Honor, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm going to withdraw my objection to the admission.
All right, I'm going to allow it anyway. So there's no objection, so now it's admitted without objection. But my ruling was going to be that even though there is some overlap between the testimony and the documents, there are some things in the records that Dr. Davis has not testified about. And furthermore, as I have been saying throughout the trial, it's not unusual for an exhibit to have some overlap with testimony, and that does not render the exhibit inadmissible. And I don't think that this is would qualify as the unnecessary presentation of cumulative evidence. But in any event, Ms. Pearson has withdrawn her objection, so it is admitted without objection. And I will inform the jury about that when the jury is back in the courtroom. Are the parties ready for the jury? Ms. Pearson, are you ready for your cross-examination? All right. Are you ready, Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Let's bring the jury in, please. Do you want to put this exhibit on the table there? Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Members of the jury, Ms. Pearson has withdrawn her objection to Exhibit D-TR-73. So that exhibit is admitted without objection. The limiting instruction that I gave you earlier applies to this exhibit. So that's the instruction that says that the evidence has been limited only for a limited purpose, and that is that you may consider the evidence only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider the evidence for any other purpose. Ms. Pearson, you may proceed.
Good morning, Dr. Davis.
Good morning.
Looking at the records that, and I think you have the exhibit in front of you, it appears It's up there. I'm going to get it and give it back to her. So that you have it available.
Thank you.
It appears the defendant was admitted to the medical unit for AMS, fever, and tachycardia, correct?
Correct.
And fever's pretty self-explanatory, and tachycardia is an irregular heartbeat?
Yes, a fast heartbeat.
And AMS is what?
Altered mental status.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Altered mental status?
Okay, thank you.
Now, when you saw him, you then saw evidence of delirium and psychosis, is that right?
Mostly I saw psychosis.
And fever could cause a person to be delirious. That's a medical condition that can cause delirium, isn't that correct?
Correct.
And the fast heartbeat could be a side effect of the delirium, would that be right?
Or more likely a side effect of the fever.
Okay, or
or
the
some other
fever.
medical.
And again, this is a lawyer,
Sure.
trying to talk to a doctor, so. From your report, it appears that you actually saw the defendant at 20:30, which would be 8:30 p.m., isn't that right?
Correct.
And that he had gotten his first dose of Haldol at 6:55 p.m., about an hour and a half earlier.
Oh, that's correct.
Now, you ultimately spent about an hour with him, is that correct?
Approximately, yes.
And then from there, he went on to someone else, to be seen by other doctors within the Denver Health Medical System.
Correct.
So you had never seen him before that date on November 15th of 2012?
No, I hadn't.
You hadn't ever treated him in the spring of 2012 or in the summer of 2012 or anywhere near July of 2012 when the offense occurred?
Correct, I haven't.
And after November 15th of 2012, when you saw him, did you ever see him again?
No, I only saw him that one time.
So your knowledge of how he behaves or what is normal behavior for him is only based on what you saw on that one date for that 1 hour?
Correct.
I believe that you talked about, for instance, when you were speaking with him, that he sort of paused in answering you?
Sometimes he did, yes.
And you don't know if that's how he regularly, what his regular speech pattern is. Would that be true?
Right.
And that is also something that it could occur with a delirium and being sedated, just pausing and answering if you've been given Haldol?
Yes. You generally see more of a lack of awareness as well, but yes, you could have the pausing.
Know if that's a regular, how he regularly presents to people, if he just simply has a flat affect.
Correct.
He did, however, know when you were talking to him that he knew he was in the hospital.
Yes.
He knew you were a doctor.
I don't believe I asked him that, but
He knew you were, he appeared to understand you were asking him questions.
Yes.
But he knew where he was,
yes.
so. And among one of the things that you asked him about is if he knew why he was in jail, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And he knew why he was in jail, didn't he?
He said, because I pulled away from the people I knew and I drank their blood. He said, I took the blood that wasn't mine to take and it was unfair. He also said I was selfish.
So he showed some awareness of why he was in jail.
I object that calls for some serious speculation.
Overruled?
He showed some awareness of why he was in jail. I mean, and he knew he was in jail.
Correct. He did know he was in jail. Well, first I believe he clarified that he was in the hospital, and we said actually it's the jail part of the hospital. But yes, those are the answers he gave. They seemed somewhat vague and consistent with disorganization.
You also noted that he was not suicidal, and in fact, he didn't say he was suicidal. Isn't that correct?
Correct. He said he was not.
Now, if a person chooses not to eat or drink, they could become delirious. Wouldn't that be right?
Yes.
And a person who becomes delirious could then become psychotic. Wouldn't that also be true?
Well, they could have psychosis as a symptom of the delirium.
And in the amount of time that you spent with him, you didn't make a definitive diagnosis about him. Would that be right?
Correct. I said he had psychosis not otherwise specified.
At that stage, would it be more of a rule-out diagnosis, that they need to do more testing or spend more time with him to try to determine what actually is going on?
Yes, and to get more history. Psychosis NOS, I used that because we didn't have enough collateral or history to make a definitive diagnosis.
You didn't have any history of him medically other than from the jail from the last couple of days?
Correct.
You didn't have any history about what he was like around the date of offense or shortly after the date of offense?
No, I did not.
Or any kind of history about what he was like before the date of offense?
Correct.
And ultimately, you never got any history of what he was like after he went back to the jail in November of 2012 either, right?
Correct.
Now, Dr. King was, for instance, asking you about catatonia, and, I'm sorry, Dr. King elevated him to your stature, which he's a lawyer.
Promoted, I think.
Mr. King was asking you about catatonia, and you also said that that can be a sign of mood disorder, correct?
Correct.
A lot of the symptoms that you saw are symptoms of both delirium and psychosis, isn't that right?
They could be. In that instance, I wasn't seeing delirium. That doesn't mean he didn't have delirium because delirium can wax and wane, but what I saw in that period did not seem consistent with delirium.
And when you talk about the waxing and waning, could it have waned for an hour and then increased later, since you
Yes.
only spent an hour with him?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that a lot of the symptoms are consistent with a lot of different kinds of conditions, medical and psychiatric?
A lot of the symptoms, meaning the psychotic symptoms?
Symptoms that you observed, a person being confused is consistent, and giving nonsensical answers can be consistent with delirium or some other kind of medical condition.
Correct.
Did you determine ever what was causing the fever and the elevated white count that you saw?
I didn't, no.
Would you agree that if a person is sitting in jail and knows that they are potentially facing the death penalty, that they might choose not to eat and drink?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
You've dealt with a lot of people who have psychiatric conditions, correct?
Yes.
And if a person has bad things going on in their life, have you seen people then who have chosen to do things that will then cause them physical harm, like not eating and drinking?
Yes.
And at the time you saw him, I believe he was also complaining of being thirsty
Yes.
and having throat pain, which would be consistent with being thirsty.
Correct.
So there was an awareness of those physical symptoms that he was currently suffering.
Yes.
One moment. Thank you, Doctor. I don't have any more questions.
Is there any redirect, Mr. King?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Doctor, counsel asked you some questions about whether or not you knew what Mr. Holmes' regular speech pattern was, and you did not. Is that right?
Correct.
The things that he said to you, were they so bizarre and nonsensical as to not really be part of a normal speech pattern? If he talked like that all the time, would he be psychotic all the time?
Yes, he wouldn't function in society if he talked like he did.
He wouldn't be able to succeed in graduate school?
Correct.
Now, you said you were asked whether he had some awareness of why he was in jail. He was told, was he not, that he was in the jail part of the hospital? Is that right?
Yes, because first he said, I thought I was in the hospital. And we clarified, you're actually in the jail part of the hospital.
And it was then that he made the statement about being in jail because I drank their blood and was selfish or something
Correct.
like that. That seemed nonsensical and psychotic response to you, disorganized response?
Yes, it was a vague, disorganized answer.
Now, you were asked about a definitive diagnosis, and you did not give a definitive diagnosis. You really couldn't, based upon the little amount of information you had. Is that fair?
Correct.
you would need to go into a full history of the patient, look at their past psychiatric conditions, look at how this condition had developed, perhaps look at their family history, any number of things in order to really do a full diagnosis.
Yes,
right?
all of that.
Now, you did note some possible diagnoses in your differential, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And those included schizophrenia, is that right?
Yes,
Bipolar with psychotic features, is
yes,
that right? And SAD, what's SAD?
schizoaffective disorder.
Schizoaffective disorder.
Yes,
Thank you. And those are all psychotic disorders, is that right?
yes.
Now, counsel asked you some questions about delirium, and I think that your question was what you saw was mostly psychosis. Do you have an opinion, doctor, as to what you observed into Mr. Holmes? Was what you were seeing psychosis, or was it delirium?
What I was seeing was psychosis at that time.
And you saw him on the first time. You didn't see anything that made you think this patient is delirious, did you?
No, I did not.
Is it true that some folks may have a metabolic disturbance from not eating or drinking for a day or two, but in a normal, healthy young man, for example, that is unlikely to result in a delirium, fair to say?
Fair to say, yes.
Given, without some other chronic medical condition or something?
Correct.
Now, you didn't see him. You were asked about whether the amount of time that you saw him, and you said that the question was, were the things you observed consistent with other medical conditions? And you said they could be. Is that right?
Right. Many of the symptoms could be part of another medical disorder.
Now, your job as a doctor is to determine what the symptoms do show. Is that right?
Correct.
In your opinion, were the symptoms that you observed the result of another medical condition, or were the symptoms that you observed the result of an altered mental state due to some psychosis, some psychiatric condition?
My best clinical impression was that it was due to psychosis. I did recommend workup for further medical conditions to rule those out, but my clinical impression was psychosis, yes.
So, and you wanted to follow up all the different possibilities, fair
Correct.
to say? And in that light, you also recommended that Mr. Holmes receive an MRI if
Correct.
he hadn't received one. Is that right?
Correct.
Why did you recommend an MRI?
Anytime someone has new onset psychotic behavior, especially if the symptoms are somewhat bizarre or out of the ordinary in what you would normally see with psychosis, it's good to get an MRI and make sure there's not any underlying pathology or other causes of psychosis that can be seen.
Thank you, doctor. I don't have any other questions, Your Honor.
All right, is there any recross, Ms. Pearson?
You took down some of the statements that the defendant said to you. Now, and Mr. King was talking with you about those. Would you agree that a person who's charged with 12 counts of murder and 70 counts of attempted murder, that a statement, "I took the blood that wasn't mine to take," is not nonsensical in light of that?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled?
In the context of how he was behaving, I didn't put much weight in his statements because they did seem vague and not necessarily consistent with or relevant to the conversation. So when someone presents as that psychotic, I tend to take what they say with a grain of salt.
But even taking it with a grain of salt, if you're asking somebody why they're in jail and they're in jail for multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, that statement in that context has some consistency to it, doesn't it?
Yes, and the weight you give it depends on how much you believe when someone is psychotic, they say things that make sense and correlate with reality. There's different opinions about that.
And saying that it's unfair and that I was selfish, again, in that context, is not necessarily nonsensical. That's also consistent with having done that, correct?
It's a possibility. Correct.
Thank you.
Doctor, the jury appears to have some questions, so please give us a moment. Thank you. Would counsel please approach? Dr. Davis, the jury has submitted some questions that, based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law, I have determined are appropriate. The first question is, can you explain the difference between psychosis and delirium?
So psychosis is a condition that includes symptoms like disorganization, hallucinations, delusions, catatonia, and then other negative symptoms like withdrawal, isolation, lack of motivation. So psychosis is a descriptor. People who are delirious can have psychotic symptoms as part of the delirium, but the psychotic symptoms found in delirium are often different than the psychotic symptoms found in what we would call a primary psychotic disorder. So a primary psychotic disorder would be something like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or schizophreniform disorder, a mental illness not necessarily caused by a medical condition. So in delirium, when people have psychotic symptoms, it tends to be things like visual hallucinations, or they may have fears or delusions that someone is chasing after them. And in delirium, the psychotic symptoms tend to be accompanied by varied levels of awareness or a decreased level of awareness.
Okay, the next question is, you mentioned that lorazepam was prescribed for Mr. Holmes's catatonia. Doesn't lorazepam result in less responsiveness or even possibly catatonia?
That's an excellent question. Actually, lorazepam has a very interesting effect in catatonia. It has what we would call a paradoxical reaction, or other than opposite to what's expected. So in catatonia, it's thought that perhaps this represents extreme excitation to the point that a person can't respond or make any purposeful or senseful actions, and that lorazepam actually calms that down, and therefore what we see is people become more responsive after receiving lorazepam and more organized, which you're right, is opposite of what you would see in someone without catatonia.
The next question is as follows. You mentioned echolalia that was clinically significant. Isn't echolalia repeating the question of the asker rather than just saying the same thing over and over?
That's a good point. So it would mean he would have needed to hear the word somewhere and then repeat it. If he didn't actually hear the word, the more appropriate term would probably be perseveration.
And the final question is, could irregular heartbeat be caused by a lack of potassium?
An irregular heartbeat could be caused by lack of potassium, yes. In his instance, he had tachycardia, which isn't an irregular heartbeat, but rather a fast heartbeat.
All right, are there any follow-up questions based on those questions and answers? Mr. King.
Yes, Judge. Just with regard to the first question, ma'am, if someone were experiencing a delirium, well, first of all, is your opinion that Mr. Holmes was experiencing a delirium or not?
Well, what I can say is during the period that I saw him, I didn't see symptoms of delirium.
Okay. If someone is experiencing a delirium, which hypothetically, let's say, resulted in them displaying some symptoms which may seem psychotic in nature, which you said is possible, is that
Yes.
right? If that were the case and that person were treated for their metabolic disturbance, if they were given fluids, if they were given potassium, whatever they needed to correct the metabolic imbalance, would that delirium clear up quickly, and would the symptoms subside quickly?
Yes, it should in a young, healthy person, assuming you're treating all the underlying problems.
And how quickly would you expect those to clear up? Difficult question, I guess, but ballpark.
In a healthy person,
Yes, ma'am.
within a day.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Any follow-up questions from you, Ms. Pearson?
No, Your Honor.
All right, may Dr. Davis be released from our subpoena, Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection, Ms. Pearson?
Your Honor.
All right, call your next witness, please.
Defense would call Dr. Philippe Weintraub.
Good morning. Could I have you raise your right hand for me, please, so that I can administer an oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm, under penalty of law, that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
All right, please be seated. Could you hand me that exhibit, please, on the other?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Good morning, doctor. How are you?
Fine.
Could you tell us your full name, please, and spell your first, middle, and last names?
My full name is Philippe Weintraub. First name Philippe, Philipppe. Last name Weintraub, Weintraub.
Mr. King, you may proceed.
Good morning, doctor. How are you?
Fine. Thank you.
Thanks for coming to speak with us this morning. Doctor, how are you employed?
Although I spend most of my time working at Denver Health, it's on a contract from the University of Colorado Department of Psychiatry, where I'm employed.
And are you a psychiatrist, sir?
Yes, I am.
Can you please run through your educational experience real quickly for us?
Okay. I received my undergraduate training at Harvard, went to the University of Virginia Medical School, and received my training in general and child psychiatry at the University of Colorado, and recently, well, in 2008, was board certified in psychosomatic medicine or consultation liaison psychiatry, which is the type of psychiatry in which I was employed when I was involved in this case.
How long have you been a practicing psychiatrist, sir?
Well, if we go back to my residency, I'd say 35 years.
And I would imagine during that course of time, you've seen a lot of people with psychiatric illness, fair to say?
Yes.
And how long have you worked, or let's focus on the time period in November of 2012. How long had you worked at Denver Health Medical Center at that point in time?
On that, and it was on that particular service, I had worked there for 8 years.
I'm marking this, what is D-TR-74. Can I approach the witness with D-TR-74, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
I'm handing you D. You identify what that is for me, doctor?
That is my resume or curriculum vitae.
Does that contain additional information about your education, experience, and other information relevant to your expertise, sir?
Yes.
Judge, I'd move the admission of D-TR-74.
Is there any objection, Mr. Bruckler?
None, sir.
All right, without objection, it is admitted.
And I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd also ask to qualify Dr. Weintraub as an expert pursuant to Rule 702 in the area of psychiatry.
Any objection, Mr. Bruckler?
None.
All right, without objection, and pursuant to Rule 702 of the Colorado Rules of Evidence and the decision in People v. Schreck, which is published at 22 Pacific 3rd, 68, Colorado, 2001, Dr. Weintraub is qualified as an expert witness in the field of psychiatry. And so, folks, that means that he now may render expert opinions in that field. I remind you that you are not bound by the testimony of a witness who testifies as an expert. The credibility of an expert's testimony is to be considered as that of any other witness. You may believe all of an expert witness's testimony, part of it, or none of it. The weight that you give the testimony is entirely your decision. Mr. King, is this a good time for me to give the limiting instruction?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Folks, I want to remind you that the court has admitted the testimony of this witness only for a limited purpose. You may consider this testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Mr. King, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, in your 34 years of clinical experience as a psychiatrist, what types of psychiatric illnesses have you treated, sir?
Well, originally I was trained as a general psychiatrist, so I saw the wide range of illnesses you would see in adults, which would include psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia, mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder, for example.
How many psychotic individuals do you think you've seen or treated over those years? I realize that's a tough question, but...
I mean, I would have to say at least in the hundreds. I'm probably crossed 1,000, but...
Is identifying the features and the symptoms of psychosis something that you develop a clinical... as your experience increases, does your clinical ability to make those interpretations increase?
Yes.
During the period of time in November of 2012, I think you said you were working at Denver Health Medical Center at that point. Is that right?
Correct.
Did you in your past ever work at the Colorado Health Mental Institute at Pueblo for a period of time?
I did.
How long was that?
At the conclusion of my residency, I worked from July of 84 through June of 85 on the forensic unit at that hospital.
What's the forensic unit? I think probably everyone can
Yeah,
tell.
to elaborate, there are patients, the patients on the forensic unit are individuals who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity, and in those days they had other statutes for less severe forms of mental impairment that were like not guilty by reason of insanity. So these are people who have already been in court and now were being treated in the hospital on the forensic unit until they were deemed to be sufficiently safe to release to the community. But also as part of that job, I did do competency and insanity evaluations.
So you actually did the kind of about full-blown sanity evaluations that other doctors, perhaps in this case, are testifying to.
I did, yes.
And was that a significant clinical experience for you, going through that period at the hospital in Pueblo?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
When you were at the Denver Health Medical Center, are you part, or were you in November of 2012? We should probably just focus on that period. Were you part of was your role a liaison type role from the psychiatric team there?
Right. So I worked on the consult team or consult liaison team, and that's related to my most recent specialty that I've gotten. Basically, consulting psychiatrists consult to other physicians who are requiring some assistance with a psychiatric problem, whether it's in surgery, pediatrics, medicine, and in this particular case, the correctional care medical facility.
So if a doctor thought someone was having a heart problem, might they refer someone to a cardiologist in the same way as they would refer to you if there was a psychiatric problem?
Correct, yes. All specialties have consultants who are available to provide their expertise if the primary physician feels that a case has gotten complicated in a particular area and they need extra help with it.
Now, the jury's just heard testimony from Dr. Rachel Davis. Are you and Dr. Davis part of a psychiatric team that works as a unit at Denver Health?
My major job is to work as a consultant during the daytime hours. Dr. Davis, I think in November of 2012, worked primarily in the psychiatry emergency room, but we're also a teaching hospital where we have residents, and I think we're connected in that way as well as supervisors, and we were both considered, members of the faculty who provided clinical care to psychiatric patients throughout the hospital.
I guess what I'm getting at is, would you agree with me that different psychiatrists saw Mr. Holmes at different times during the period of time he was during his stay at Denver Health?
Correct.
And were you all communicating with each other and working as a team with regard to his treatment at the time? I'm assuming that the notes went into a chart and there was a purpose for that. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I'm going to hand you what I've marked as D-TR-75, if I may approach the witness.
You may.
D-TR-75. Is that your handwritten note from the chart for Mr. Holmes back in November of 2012, Doctor?
Well, most of it is a handwritten note from the resident that I was supervising that day.
Okay.
He and I saw Mr. Holmes together. The portion of the note that has my handwriting is the section on the bottom of the second page where it says attending only below this line. I'm an attending, and everything written there is my handwriting. I also initialed my residence documentation to indicate that I was, I had reviewed it and was in agreement with it.
So he's being the scribe, so to say, for both of you seeing the patient together. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, we saw him together and both asked questions, but I was ultimately responsible for the decisions that were made.
Okay, and then that's why you initialed and signed off on his part of the report as well.
Correct.
Now, is that report or those notes kept in the normal course of the way you do things at Denver Health Medical Center when you see a patient?
That is correct.
And are those notes created contemporaneously or very close in time to when you do see the patient and make those actual observations?
They are. We actually, we have them timed, but yes, this note was written right after we met with Mr. Holmes.
And obviously, those notations are made by yourself, a psychiatrist, and by the resident who is also a psychiatrist. So they're made by someone who's in a position to know what they're talking about, who actually makes the observations. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
And are they maintained in the Denver Health Medical Center's medical records section in order to be accurate so that they can be used for future purposes if there was a future condition that arose or needed to be transmitted to some other facility or for whatever purpose so that they could be an accurate record of what had taken place?
That's correct.
Now, you saw Mr. Holmes on one day, is that right?
That is correct.
What day was that? Do you recall?
It was,
Did you need to look at your notes?
I can look at it. I do remember it was Monday, the 19th of November, 2012.
Now, was he admitted on the 15th?
That is correct.
So he'd then been there 4 days or at that point,
Yes.
is that right? Was this the first time you saw him?
It was the first time I saw him.
And just so the jury knows, was this towards the end of his stay at your hospital?
It was towards the end because he was discharged the next day.
And prior to seeing Mr. Holmes, did you review the chart or have discussions with any of the other psychiatrists to kind of bring you up to speed on what his condition had been and how it might have changed during his stay there?
I did, yes.
And did that chart, do you remember, include notes from the medical chart at the jail where he had been previously?
Yes.
When you saw him on the 19th, what was your understanding, sir, of why he was there, the history of his present condition?
I think what had happened in the jail was that he had developed what was suspected to be an acute psychosis, where he wasn't in touch with reality, he was acting not like himself, and that this psychosis was associated with a variety of behaviors that included not eating well, which culminated in his getting sufficiently ill physically that he had to be ultimately admitted to Denver Health.
Okay. What was the goal that you had when you saw him in treating Mr. Holmes?
Well, my first goal was to see whether or not he had improved with the treatments that had been prescribed to him over the previous few days. Also to, confirm that I agreed with the diagnoses that had been made. And then once I did perform those two tasks, come up with some plan for how to best, improve his condition further, before the next person saw him.
And did you, after having your spending the time that you did with Mr. Holmes, did you form an opinion as to whether you were in agreement with the diagnosis that had been attributed up to that point or not?
Yes, I did agree with the diagnosis that had been made by the previous psychiatrist.
And was that psychosis, NOS, or not otherwise specified?
That is correct.
Now, when you saw him on the morning of the 19th, was Mr. Holmes oriented as to, like, the year it was or the month it was? Did you do anything to test
Yeah,
that?
we did test his orientation, and he did reasonably well. I wouldn't say he wasn't perfect, but as the notes say, he was oriented to person, place, month and the year. He was a little bit, he wasn't totally clear about where he had come from at first, but then it came to him. So that struck me as not being totally normal, that he would have to struggle with recalling where he had been before he had come to Denver Health.
And so recalling the jail being the place he'd been before?
Yeah.
And did, so he knew who he was and what the date was, though?
Yes.
And at that point, had he been on an antipsychotic medication since the 15th when he'd been admitted?
Yes, I mean, he had been on some type of antipsychotic. He had originally been placed on Haldol, and then it was switched to risperidone, or the brand name Risperdal.
What's the difference between Haldol and Risperdal in terms of their effect, I guess, or usage?
I think for the purposes of this discussion, not much. Risperidone is what we call a second-generation antipsychotic. It's the first of that generation, and it and its successors were created because it was felt that they would have a better side effect profile. But in terms of the actual effect on psychosis, both drugs work well. It's just now in the 21st century, we tend not to use Haldol as much, except in emergency situations because of its side effects.
Okay. When you spoke to Mr. Holmes, did you inquire as to whether or not he'd been hearing voices or not?
Yes, we did ask him about that.
And what did he tell you about that?
Well, I don't think at the moment we were actually talking to him, he was experiencing them, but he had experienced them previously. He had reported.
Okay. Did he report that had decreased, the frequency of those had decreased?
Yeah, he thought that the medication had been helpful in alleviating his symptoms.
Do you share in that?
Oh, absolutely. It was clear. I mean, I was quite struck by how much better he appeared to me than the way he was described in the previous notes. And then it turns out my resident had also seen him Friday, so he was able to actually directly compare two different sets of observations, and he was markedly struck by how much better he looked when we saw him together.
Okay. At the point that you saw him were you aware that when he was admitted there might have been some metabolic disturbance and that he may have been not eating or drinking properly when he was admitted?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, I think the working diagnosis when he first came in was that he had some type of what we call a delirium, which is also an alteration in your mental state that is due primarily to a medical condition.
Okay.
Yes.
And that was your understanding of what the doctors that saw him on the 15th had thought?
Correct.
And by the time you saw him 4 days later, had that metabolic disturbance been cleared up? Had he been given IV fluids and potassium and other things to correct the metabolic disturbance that might have given rise to a delirium?
Correct, yes. That had resolved.
And so did you see any evidence of a delirium at the time you saw him on the 19th?
I didn't see what was observed by the other physicians. He probably was still recuperating from the effects of it, but it sometimes takes a while to fully clear from a delirium. But what I primarily saw was the psychosis that day. That was more prominent. The delirium was clearly, if not totally resolved, just about completely resolved. I mean, his metabolic abnormalities had already improved because they had done repeat blood draws, and so we knew that the cause for the delirium had been eliminated, and he was now recovering from it.
So at the time you saw him, was it starting to look like psychosis was, if not the only problem, a major component of the problem?
Yeah, yes, I would say it was the predominant component of his presentation.
Now, after reading the entire chart, including the notes from the jail, do you have an opinion as to whether his symptoms of psychosis came on prior to his not eating or vice versa?
I think his symptoms of psychosis came on before he stopped eating.
Is that something that's fairly common among folks who do become psychotic, that they may become paranoid about their food or drink and stop eating or drinking?
Oh, sure. That does happen frequently. When people have delusions about their food, or even if they're just distracted by their psychosis, it may be hard for them to focus on activities of daily living.
Okay. Did you ask him, or did he give you any information about shadows, or that he was hiding from shadows or something along those lines?
Yeah, that was one of the major issues we addressed with him. He had remained in restraints because he had put a blanket over his head when he told us he'd been seeing shadows that made him, frightened, possibly paranoid. So we spent time talking to him about that issue.
Okay. And you said that was why he was restrained at that point in time?
Right.
And is there a video camera in that room that he was in, at the forensic unit at?
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but we do have a video in all the rooms for the patients. Yes.
Did the fact that he was telling you that he had been hiding from shadows under his blanket suggests some psychotic process? Was that one of the things that you took into consideration?
Yes, I did.
Was his speech somewhat disorganized or not? What was your opinion?
Yes. I mean, we generally understood what he was saying, but at times he had trouble kind of staying on track, and his speech was a little hard to follow. It's hard to understand his train of thought at times. Clearly it was much better than it had been several days earlier. We were actually able to have a conversation, but he wasn't as clear in his thinking as I would have liked to have seen, as evidenced by his speech pattern.
Overall, any indication or any thought at that point in time about his condition? Did you form an opinion as to whether he had improved enough to be released back to the care of the psychiatrist and psychologist at the jail, or what was your determination about his prognosis at that point?
I felt that he was sufficiently improved that if he could find a way to not put the blanket over his head and get out of restraints for about another day, there would be a good chance that we could then contemplate sending him back to the jail. So I could see an end point of returning to the jail reasonably soon after my assessment.
Nonetheless, did you still see, in your mind, clear evidence of a psychotic process going on?
Oh, yes. I still thought he was sufficiently psychotic that I didn't feel comfortable that day sending him back. I wanted to see additional improvement in psychosis.
And you talked about your agreement with the general diagnosis of psychosis, NOS, or not otherwise specified. Am I right in understanding that absent a lot more information about this patient, about his history, his prior psychiatric conditions or symptoms, and that's really the only, you're limited in the diagnosis that you can make at that point in time. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
And is that why you gave a general diagnosis of psychosis, NOS, as opposed to a specific diagnosis like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or something like that?
Yes, that's true.
Did you have a differential in your mind, or was that just not part of your consideration at that point?
Sure. I mean, I was wondering, what type of psychotic illness could have caused him to be this way. So yes, I think you should always, a psychiatrist should always be thinking, possible etiology or cause is there for the illness so that, you can, if you need to, make adjustments in treatment to properly take care of the condition. Although, as it turns out, the leading candidates for what might have been causing his psychosis were illnesses, all of which would have responded to Risperdal. So the good news was, even if I didn't know what illness he was suffering from, I knew that the most likely candidates were those for which the medicine we were prescribing would be efficacious.
What were the most likely candidates in your mind, doctor?
Well, remember, I'm only working on the assumption that this is a person who's had a psychotic episode in the jail, like a first onset.
And if you don't feel comfortable, I don't want to ask you for an opinion. You don't feel comfortable.
No, I think.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This is not a scientific or medical opinion. If this is just speculation, and I'm going to object to relevance.
Sorry, and lack of foundation.
Why don't you ask your question again,
Sure.
Mr. King?
Sure. Did you, at the time, back in November of 2012, have a differential diagnosis in your mind that you formed based upon your expertise and clinical experience as to what the possible diagnoses might be in that differential?
And is there an objection?
Yes, Your Honor. To any just possibility. It's not an opinion.
Doctor, can you answer the question without speculating?
Okay.
And if you cannot, then tell us that you cannot. I'm not asking you to necessarily answer the question. What I'm inquiring about is whether you're able to answer the question without speculation. You're not allowed to speculate, but if you can answer the question and phrase it in a way that it avoids speculation on your part, then you can answer it that way. Does that make sense?
Right.
All right.
There's a whole host of things that could have caused him to become psychotic. I mean, starting with the episode in the jail, something could have happened that traumatized him in the jail that caused him to become psychotic. He could have had an acute psychotic episode from being in jail. Or the psychosis could have been a manifestation of an underlying psychiatric illness that either had not manifested itself yet or had in the past, but I just didn't know about that. So schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, schizoaffective disorder, which is kind of intermediate between schizophrenia and a mood disorder, depression with psychotic features. Those would be the most likely candidates.
Okay. I have no further questions of this witness, Judge. I would move the admission of D-TR 75.
Do you have any objection to the admission of that exhibit, Mr. Brockler? All right, without objection, it is admitted. But members of the jury, I remind you that the limiting instruction that I gave you earlier applies to that exhibit as well as the CV for this witness that was admitted before that. All right, Mr. Brockler, you may proceed with your cross-examination.
Morning, Doctor. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
A couple things, not a ton, but certainly I want to sort of start in a place I hadn't expected based on that last answer. You said a traumatic event could cause some sort of psychotic episode. What do you mean by that?
Oh, if the person was really had gone through some sort of upsetting experience and might be vulnerable to getting psychotic, they could have psychotic symptoms. But
What do you mean by upsetting experience, and how does that manifest itself in terms of some sort of psychotic episode?
well, sometimes people who have conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder can become psychotic. Hear voices and things like that. But that tends to be more rare than the other conditions.
So an event, some traumatic, horrific event could cause someone's mental status to change?
Could, yes.
Or could it make it actually worse?
Well, it could exacerbate something that was already there, yeah.
Interesting. Could someone who, let's say, tried to murder a theater full of people, could that kind of an event, coming to grips with what they've done, could that have an impact on someone's mental health?
It's hard to say. I'm not sure about that.
Seems like a pretty traumatic event, right? You agree, Your Honor?
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir. Seems like a pretty traumatic event. Yes?
Yeah, it's hard to know without not having spoken to the defendant about that. I don't know what his state of mind was then about then.
And again, forgive me, I'm not asking you about that. What I'm asking you about is when you say a traumatic event could cause someone to have a psychotic episode at the jail. You said that, correct? Is that yes? And I'm sorry, all the words have to get typed down by this.
Right, yes.
Certainly, a definition of a traumatic event might be the actual execution of an attempted murder of up to 400 people.
Objection to the phrase, the form of the question is argumentative.
Overruled.
Go ahead, doctor. That could definitely be a traumatic event.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of it so much in those terms. I see where you're going with that. I don't know if that would be true or not in that case.
You don't know?
No.
Now, you talked about, first off, you saw this guy for as little as 15 minutes. Is that fair?
I don't remember the precise number of minutes. I mean, I think it would have been a little longer than that, but that...
You remember giving a... I'm sorry, sir. Go ahead.
It could have been 15, 20,
Okay.
25. I don't know precisely how many.
Somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes feels about right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
I think so, yeah.
And that is the only time in your life that you have seen this guy. Is that fair?
That's true.
So you don't know what he was like before other than through what people have said or wrote down, correct?
That's correct.
And when you looked at the jail records that Mr. King referred you to, you looked at the jail records going back the 4 months before you saw him, going back to when he was first admitted to the Arapahoe County Detention Center?
I reviewed the records around the time that he started getting psychotic.
So you reviewed the records going back 4 or 5 days, perhaps?
Yes.
So you don't know what he was like in the months leading up to this event?
Correct. I reviewed the records that we had at Denver Health.
I appreciate that. Thank you. One of the other things, did you check to see whether or not he had been medicated in the 4 months prior to him coming to Denver Mental Health?
I think we asked him that. He said he had not been medicated.
He was able to tell you that he had
That's my, again, it's a vague recollection, but I remember being under the impression that he had not been on medication before.
And you have no idea why that is, right?
I'm not 100% sure about that. I know that I did call the jail to get some information, and they had said that he had not been seeing mental health professionals.
That's your understanding?
That was my understanding, yeah.
Okay. Something you said, too, I don't know the answer to this. You said Haldol is used only in emergencies because it has some side effects.
Well,
what are the side effects?
Well, I mean, we can use it in normal circumstances as well, but it causes what we call extrapyramidal side effects where you can get a lot of stiffness. And in younger males, that's more common.
Okay. Stiffness in like muscles or something? Body?
Yeah. And it's more likely long-term to cause something called tardive dyskinesia, where you have abnormal movements.
Sorry. Oh, here it is. Couple things. You also recalled that there was neuroimaging done, fair?
Yes.
And that it was normal.
Correct.
And that you're not sure, but he may have had some kind of a bruise on his forehead. Is that true? You remember?
Yeah, I think from reviewing the records, yes.
But you don't remember seeing a bruise on his forehead?
I don't recall at the moment seeing a bruise. I'd have to check my notes, but
Bless you. Hey, some of the other things that might impact someone's cognitive state of their mental health, and you indicated that in a previous conversation, was stress. Fair? Is that true?
Sure, yeah.
And something else, as you know from your experience, that might cause someone's, whatever their mental health is, to deteriorate is isolation. Is that true?
Correct.
And I'm sorry to keep following up. Every time you say, I just want to make sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I'm
yes.
sorry.
My apologies.
I don't mean to keep going back.
No, that's fine.
So, stress, isolation. How about, you would agree with me that the stress of facing potentially hundreds of counts of murder and attempted murder, stressful, fair?
True, yes.
Also, potentially facing the death penalty, stressful, true? Also, all the court matters associated with that process, very stressful, fair?
That's true, yes.
And you don't know what court matters were happening right before or going to be set to come up right after this event where he stopped eating and drinking? You don't know that?
I did not.
But one of the things he was able to say to you that you recall is when you began talking with him, you and Dr. Morose, was he was concerned about how what he would say might impact his legal proceedings. Do you remember that?
Yes. I'm not sure if he phrased it quite that way. I think he wanted to know what this was going to be used for.
That was your impression, is he had concerns about how his statements would be used in court. Fair?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Well, he didn't use the word court. I think he just wanted to know why are we asking these questions? How is the information going to be used? It was that general. I don't know what he was thinking behind that.
I understand.
But I infer that it could relate to that.
Yeah. Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, do you have any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
All right, the jury appears to have at least one question, Doctor, so give us a moment, please.
Sure.
Thank you. Counsel, please approach. Doctor, the jury has submitted a question that based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law I have determined is appropriate. The question is, normally, how quickly do Haldol and Risperdal take effect on a patient to relieve symptoms?
That's a good question. It's hard to give a simple answer. I think if someone is acutely agitated in the context of psychosis, the medicines can work within a few hours to calm the person down. But in terms of the long-term beneficial effects on psychosis, it can take, days and up to weeks to see the full effects of the medication. Someone may develop significant improvement the way Mr. Holmes did by the time I saw him, to the point that they can return to the jail. But one would expect to continue to see improvement from that dose even after that point in time.
Any follow-up questions, Mr. King?
Thank you.
Any follow-up questions, Mr. Brockler?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
May this witness be released from his subpoena?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, sir.
All right, thank you, sir.
Leave this here.
Leave that there. Thank you. Mr. King, call your next witness, please.
The defense would call Detective David Tyling.
Good afternoon. Could I solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, please be seated.
Thank you.
Could you hand me that exhibit there, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Sir, could you please tell us your full name and spell your first, middle, and last names?
David J. Thaling, David, D-A-V-I-D. Last name is Thaling, T-H-A-I-L-I-N-G.
Mr. King, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
How are you employed, sir?
I'm employed with the City of Aurora Police Department.
And what's your title there?
Presently, I'm a detective there.
And how long have you been employed for the Aurora PD?
20 years.
And did you become involved in some manner with the shooting at the theater that took place on July 20th, 2012, in the early morning hours, sir?
Yes, I did.
And suffice it to say that for all of you at the Aurora Police Department, that sounds like it was kind of an all-hands-on-deck situation at that point. Is that fair to say? Everyone was doing what they could to help. Fair to say?
Yes.
And did you, as in the course of doing that, respond to the headquarters at about 2:40 a.m. and meet with Detective Apple, who were there with a suspect named James Egan Holmes?
Yes.
Where was Mr. Holmes located at that time, sir?
I was located, we have two interview rooms on the third floor, and he was in one of the two rooms.
Okay. And were you asked by Detective Apple to keep an eye on Mr. Holmes in that room and to specifically videotape what was going on in that room as he waited in that interview room?
I did meet with Detective Apple, and there was two other uniformed officers there that were providing assistance with that. So I spoke with Detective Apple about, how I can assist.
Okay. And those other officers, were they Officer Revale and Irons?
Yes.
And did you insert a DVD into your recorder there and actually record Mr. Holmes during that period of time in that interview room?
The interview, no. I came after the interview with Mr. Holmes.
Right, and I'm talking about when he was in the holding cell after the interview with Mr. Holmes, just sitting and being watched by these other police officers.
In the interview room? Yes, I did.
If I may approach the witness, Your Honor.
Yes. I believe that's right.
I'm going to show this to counsel. Sir, I'm handing what 76. Do you recognize that beat?
Yes, I do.
Does that have you had a chance to review that, sir?
Yes, I have.
And did you initial and date it upon your review?
Yes.
And is that a fair and accurate representation or copy of the DVD that you recorded of Mr. Holmes in that interview room following the interview that was conducted by the detectives?
Yes, it is.
Judge, I'd move for the admission of D-TR-76.
Mr. Edson, is there any objection?
There is not.
Without objection, D-TR-76 is admitted and may be published.
Your Honor, I have no further questions of this witness. This interview is some 4 hours in length, or this videotape is some 4 hours in length, so I'm not asking to publish it right at this moment, but
Okay.
at a future time.
All right, and would this be a good time for me to give the instruction, or you want to wait?
We can wait upon publishing if you
Okay.
would like, Your Honor.
That's fine. All right, do you have any cross-examination, Mr. Edson?
No, I don't at this time, Judge.
All right. And the jury does not have any questions for this witness. May this witness be released from his subpoena, Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
Any objection?
We may have him under subpoena. We'd keep him just in case.
All right. Sir, you're free to go for now, but you may be called back again, okay?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Call your next witness, please.
Can I approach very briefly on scheduling?
Yes. All right, Mr. King, you may call your next witness, please.
The defense would call Officer Revelry.
Good morning, sir. Good morning. Do you solemnly swear or affirm on a penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I will. All right, please be seated. Tell us your full name for the record and spell your first, middle, and last names, please.
Officer Gary Revelry, and it's R-I-V as in Victor, A-L-E.
All right. Mr. King, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Officer.
Morning.
Trying to get you out of here before the noon hour. And
Okay.
I've been mispronouncing your name. Your name is pronounced Revelry.
Revelry,
I
like the morning.
apologize for that. How are you employed, sir?
I am a police officer through the city of Aurora.
And how long have you been thusly employed?
With Aurora for 11 years.
Were you involved in some fashion with or had contact with a suspect named Mr. James Holmes in the early morning hours of July 20th, 2012, sir?
Yes, I was.
And was that at the headquarters building of the Aurora Police Department?
Yes, sir.
And when you responded there, approximately what time was it that you responded there and encountered Mr. Holmes there?
At the headquarters, or?
Yes, sir, at the headquarters.
Well, I don't know exactly the time.
That's fine. Was it in the early morning hours?
Early morning hours. I got dispatched or I self-dispatched at 12:39 in the morning, so
Okay.
it was after that.
And when you were there, were you assigned to be one of two officers to basically keep an eye on Mr. Holmes as he sat in that interview room following the interview done by Detectives Apple and Detective Mel?
Yes.
While you were watching him during that period of time, first of all, how long approximately do you think you were watching him?
Over an hour.
Okay. Did you keep your attention on Mr. Holmes at all time during that period?
Yes, I did.
And did he have any conversation with you or you with him or any other officers?
No conversations at all.
Okay.
The only thing the conversation that I had with him, I asked who he was and where he lived.
And he was able to tell you that, is that right?
That's correct.
His name and his address?
Yes.
And as far as you know, those were accurate, the information he gave you was accurate, is that right?
He gave it to me like he was telling me the truth, yes.
Matter of fact. During the period of time that you were there, did you notice that at times Mr. Holmes would stare at the walls and open his eyes up really wide such that his eyebrows would go up like that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And after, at some point, did Detective Tailing put paper bags on Mr. Holmes' hands?
Yes.
Is that pursuant to police protocol to preserve any evidence that
Yes,
might
sir,
be
for
on there?
gunshot residue.
And after the hands were bagged, what did Mr. Holmes do with the bags? Anything peculiar that he did?
Well, he was moving his hands back and forth like talking puppets, kind of
Okay.
moving his hands back and forth.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. I don't have any other questions for this witness, Your Honor.
All right, cross-examination.
I think I've been mispronouncing it too. It's Revelry like at boot camp?
Like
the
in-
trumpet waking
in the
everybody
morning.
up?
Yes, sir.
Mr. King asked you about responding to the station, and what happened was you first self-dispatched to the theater at around 12:39 a.m. and then eventually followed Sheldon Irons, Officer Sheldon Irons, as he transported the defendant from the scene of the theater to the police station.
Yes.
You got to the police station, and is this where you got from the defendant his identifying information?
Yes.
Tell us where that was, where he gave you that
It's
information.
in an upstairs interview room. It's on the third floor at our headquarters. It's next to our victim services. There's some interview rooms that they do the interviews in.
And you asked him, what did you ask him? Do you remember?
Who he was, name, date of birth, and address.
And he told you his name was James Holmes?
James Holmes.
Give you his middle name?
James Egan Holmes.
And he give you the correct date of birth?
He gave me a 12/13 of 87.
And then did he give you a address, 1690 Pear Street, number 10?
Yes.
Even give you the zip code?
Zip code.
So it's not like you asked him, what's your address? And he said Mars or something like that.
Exactly. He gave me the correct address.
An address and name that sort of indicated a connection to reality.
Yes.
To the speculation and lack of foundation.
Sustain us to lack of foundation.
Now, you talked about at some point that he would stare at the walls and open his eyelids wide open and his eyebrows would lift up, correct?
That's correct.
And how much of experience do you have with people who have just committed a crime involving shooting a theater full of people?
Objection beyond the scope.
Overruled?
Has that ever happened to you before?
Not on a theater shooting, no.
So, do you know what sort of the normal reaction or normal response would be associated with a person who's done something like that, even maybe when they've been dreaming about it for years, wanting to do that?
Objection to the compound question, lack of foundation.
Sustain us to lack of foundation.
All right, have you ever experienced a person who had been wanting to kill a lot of people for a long time, actually gone ahead and done it in a fashion like what happened at the theater, and seen what they were like afterwards?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
Have you ever seen that before?
Like somebody that just committed a crime with their adrenaline being really high?
Yeah.
Yes.
How about a crime like this?
But on a massive scene like this, it's my first one in 20 years or 18 years at that time.
Fair to say a person committing a crime like this, if they had all that adrenaline going afterwards, that they might act a little unusual.
Yes.
Like what you saw in the interview room.
Yes.
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Now, you talked about the bagging of the hands as being a standard police procedure to protect the potential for gunshot residue evidence, correct?
That's correct.
And you talked about that when this was done, the defendant sort of played like puppets with the bags, correct?
Yes.
And you said they were like puppets talking to each other. Did the defendant give them any voices or anything like that?
No.
And I want you to think about that, and I want you to think about the puppets. Could it also be that instead of really being puppets, it was more of living out a drum beat in someone's head?
Objection calls for speculation.
Well, given what he was asked on direct, I'm going to allow it. He's just asking if that was possible. I take that to be a follow-up to the question on direct examination, so.
Do you remember the question?
No.
Okay, let me give you a prefatory question. You ever seen like someone like pretending to play the drums, you know, da-da-da, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Maybe even along with a beat to a song they know?
Yes.
And I want you to think about the movements. Just go back to the movements you saw with the defendant's hands in the bags, and think. You said it looked like puppets, but it could also have been. Did it look like to you that it might have been sort of a drum thing where you're living out a beat in your head and using the puppets as a sound to do that?
And officer, you can't speculate, but you can testify based on your observations of what it looked like, just the same way you did in direct examination.
Okay.
Same objection.
Same ruling.
Okay, yes, like they were going back and forth to a beat.
Okay, it could have been that?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Nothing further.
All right, is there any redirect?
One question, please. Sir, you wrote a report as a result of your interaction with Mr. Holmes. Is that correct?
That's correct. I put my copy right there next to the water.
And what you wrote in that report about what Mr. Holmes did with his hands is that after we bagged his hands, Mr. Holmes would move his hands in a talking puppet motion. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. No other questions.
Is there any request?
Just one question, Your Honor. When you wrote that, did you know that the defendant had listened to techno music as he had committed the crime?
Objection, relevance, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Did
It's
you know that?
relevant, and he's not asking him to speculate. He's asking him if he knows.
Did you know that?
No.
Thank you, nothing further.
All right, the jury does not appear to have any questions. May this witness be released from his subpoena, Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection, Mr. Orman?
Thank you.
All right, officer, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, members of the jury, it's 5:12. Let's go ahead and take our lunch break. Please make sure that you abide by all my admonitions during the break, and I'll see you back here at 1:35. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom now. Is there anything we need to talk about at this time on behalf of the people?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
On behalf of the defense?
No, thank you.
All right, have a good lunch. I'll see you at 1:35. Thank you.